Houston when it's not flooding. I hope that you're here because each of you, one way or another, has a love for history. Some lowbrows from the great unwashed who have never attended a World Affairs Council program ask questions like, what good is history? My favorite answer is, well, it's good because it shows us two things: how much things change and how much they stay the same. And sometimes history can actually be applied to our daily lives. And that's my goal this evening, to show that for two reasons, because things have stayed the same, you're going to hear some things tonight about presidential leadership that you can apply to your efforts in your leadership field, regardless of whatever your field of endeavor may be. The first timeless fact: to be a great leader, you've got to be a great persuader. The second timeless fact: what it takes to be a great persuader is the same today as it was in George Washington's era. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my new book, which came out 2 months ago, is called How the Best Did It: Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. And it covers the most important leadership traits of who I consider to be the 8 greatest presidents in American history: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. And in researching the strengths of each of these presidents, I saw that they all had one trait in common: they were all great persuaders. Though, as you'll see, they went about persuading in their own unique ways. So exactly how they succeeded in persuading, in leading our nation to new heights in their eras, I believe is worthy of our attention tonight, because after all, we're all in the persuasion business, one way or another. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see what it was that made them great persuaders, and see if we can use that knowledge to up our games as leaders in our fields. First great president, George Washington. Now, as far as public persuasion went, you think of great oratory. Well, that didn't work for George Washington because he had 2 strikes against him that kept him from being a great orator. Number one, he had a soft, breathy voice long before there were any microphones from a childhood respiratory illness, so it was impossible for him to project to any size crowd. And secondly, as you probably know, he had some real issues with his teeth, such that by the time he became president, he only had 1 tooth remaining in his head. If you ever get a chance to go to Mount Vernon and the museum there, you'll see his dentures. And you can't imagine anybody being able to talk with those things in their mouth. It's like talking through a small bird cage. But despite these voice and teeth issues, nonetheless, Washington was a great persuader. And so you say, well, how did he do that? Well, first of all, he was well known for his achievements. Most people tune into deeds more importantly than words, and there was a high level of awareness of Washington's deeds. After all, he'd been probably our bravest soldier in the French and Indian War, serving in the British Army. He had horses shot out from under him. He had bullet holes through his hat, bullet holes through his uniforms. It was a providential miracle that he survived the French and Indian War. And so when that was over, there was it was a well-known fact that this guy's amazing. He's fearless. He survives. And that was instrumental in the choice of him becoming the leader of our Continental Army during the American Revolution. That was an 8-year war. And against all odds, as you know, we won. So there was another major military achievement. And then a couple years later, when it was time to start a brand new government and we needed a new constitution, Washington was chosen to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. So there was this high awareness, military success, political success, and people recognize that. You know that in your own experience. When you have someone who enters the room who has a high level of achievement, you want to meet him. You want to hear what he's got to say. You want to follow, see if he's for real. And that was certainly the case with George Washington. But obviously it took more than that to be a great persuader. What were the other factors that caused Washington to earn trust? Well, one factor was certainly He looked the part. He looked the part. He looked straight out of central casting. If George Washington walked into this room, you couldn't miss him. You couldn't help but be totally impressed. First of all, he was the tallest guy in the room. He was 6'3", which would be like being 6'9" today. He had ramrod straight posture. He was impeccably dressed, measuring his buttons on his sleeves within a 1/16 of an inch. He moved with the grace of an athlete. He was an expert horseman and always rode a gleaming white horse. He had incredibly piercing eyes whenever he listened, such that if you're talking and George Washington's listening, you know somebody's paying serious attention. And most people like that. The portrait artist Gilbert Stuart said, when you look in George Washington's eyes, you see the eyes of the fiercest warrior in the jungle. Above that, he didn't swear, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't philander. And so you put all of these traits together in terms of this overwhelming, impressive appearance, and he had what's called command presence. So for those of you who are aspiring to be leaders and it's time to go to work and you want to be the leader at your company, before you leave your house, look in the mirror and ask yourself, how's my command presence? Above the mere presence of his size and all of his impressive features, though, there was more. There was integrity / credibility. You remember the old fable. Parson Weems, who wrote the first biography of Washington, made up this wonderful story. Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. You remember that story? Well, it was not true, but Weems was searching for a metaphor to describe the lifelong commitment to honesty and integrity of George Washington, and that was his choice, and that part was 100% accurate. No one ever accused George Washington of telling a lie. But then the final trait that made him such a great persuader and unifier as the first president of the country was he had a rare gift among politicians. That is, he not only knew when to speak, he knew when not to speak. Keep in mind, here we are, brand new country, he's the first president, and in a matter of months, we have major factions at war with each other. And they form our first political parties. The Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and what was then called the Republicans, which evolved into today's Democratic Party, but in that era they called the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they were fighting over everything. And here's Washington. His number one goal, we got a brand new country. I spent 8 years fighting the Revolutionary War. I don't want it to fall. I've got to keep things unified. How do you do that? You don't take sides. So as these warring factions are going at it, you let them go at it. You stay above the fray. You don't take the bait. Historian Mark Updegrove concluded that, quote, conscious that political passions threatened to split the country, Washington largely kept his voice still so as not to add to the passions, keeping his opinions in check until policy decisions were required so as not to add to the divisions. So Washington, a great persuader because of his command presence, his accomplishments that everyone knew of, his total credibility, and because he knew when and when not to speak to maintain unity. Our second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Now, like Washington, Jefferson was not a great public speaker. In fact, this was one of the most interesting things I found in my research, that during his 8-year presidency, Thomas Jefferson gave a grand total of 2 speeches. His inaugural addresses were the only speeches he ever gave. Now keep in mind, he's our third president. He follows John Adams. The John Adams presidency, a one-term presidency, in many ways had been disastrous. And the reason was because Adams, a Federalist, Congress was controlled by the Federalists. They had thin skins. They didn't like to be criticized. And so they passed what was called the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize President Adams or any Federalist policy. And so people were being thrown in jail for exercising their freedom of speech and freedom of the press rights. Fortunately, by its terms, the Sedition Act expired at the end of Adams' presidency. But that was the nation that Thomas Jefferson entered into day one of his presidency with that kind of division. And again, we're at the start of the 19th century, brand new company. Is this going to work with this kind of division? Jefferson took it upon himself to be the unifier in chief. How did he do it? Well, he wasn't a great speaker. He couldn't give these wonderful orations that would cause people to want to unify, but he was great at in-person, up-close and personal, small group persuasion. That was his forte. And so during his 8-year presidency, 2 to 3 times a week, every single week, he would host these small dinners, 14 to 20 people, Republicans, Federalists, lots of wine, great food. One rule: we won't talk about hot button political issues. We'll talk about music, we'll talk about history, we'll talk about literature, we'll talk about what we do for a living, we'll talk about our families, we'll talk about everything you talk about with somebody who you want to become a friend. And it was in that arena, the small dinner arena, and you don't achieve breaking down these political division walls to where people can actually enjoy somebody's company in 1 dinner or 3 dinners or 5 dinners. But Jefferson was relentless. And we think about it today, could this still work? And the answer is yes, because we have the same adages in place today that Jefferson did. Number 1, effective politics is all about the quality of your relationships. If you have a great relationship with somebody, they want to work with you. They're willing to think in terms of supporting you, even if you're in the other party. If you don't have that kind of relationship, forget it. The other adage: if somebody likes you, they'll typically give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, they won't. And so Jefferson got that. He knew he was much more likely to get people to go his way if they liked him. And he was charming. He was a Renaissance man. He knew how to guide conversation where everybody would have a great time, kept pouring the wine, kept serving the food, and the walls came tumbling down. Jon Meacham, in his Jefferson biography, said that at the dinners, the president's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. So Thomas Jefferson, a great persuader as a relentless relationship builder. Third great president, Abraham Lincoln. Most people think of Lincoln as our most eloquent president, and he was. But you may ask yourself, how did he get to be so eloquent? This was a man who had less than 1 year of formal schooling. He didn't go to high school or college or law school. In childhood, he went less than 1 year. How could somebody come out of that limited educational experience and be so eloquent? Well, the answer is he did 3 things over the course of his life that kept his head in the game as far as word power was concerned. First, as a child, he was a voracious reader. Now, where he lived, out in the wilderness, there weren't a whole lot of books, but the books that were there were the great books. The King James Bible, Shakespeare's plays, Aesop's fables, the work of the classic poets. And Lincoln had a photographic memory. What he read, he remembered. And so all these wonderful words from all these wonderful books stayed stuck in his head, and he could recite them on command from Shakespeare, from Scripture. He could work these words into his own sentences. So that was the first aspect of what he did that caused him to be so eloquent. The second, of course, he was a very effective trial and appellate lawyer. He argued over 400 cases to the Illinois Supreme Court. Now, as a lawyer, obviously, you learn how to frame your arguments for them to have maximum persuasion. And so he certainly did that. But there was another talent that came with being a great trial lawyer, and that is you learned that you said different things to different audiences. You talk differently to a jury compared to a judge, compared to a client, compared to an opposing counsel. Lincoln got that. He matched his words always to his audience. And then third and finally, he was a politician who ran for political office basically his entire adult life, such that he was constantly giving speeches. And for him, practice made perfect. So these were the word power foundations from his years as a reader, a lawyer, and a politician that caused Lincoln to hone his skills as a persuader for the last 35 years of his life. But those were what he did. How did the specific rhetorical skills, what did he follow there that caused his words to always hit the bullseye? Well, there were 5 word power traits that made him such a persuasive leader. First, he was obsessed with word precision. Now, I suspect most people in this audience, somewhere along your educational experience, encountered Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. And that book can be summarized in 8 words. Say exactly what you mean, eliminate unnecessary words. Lincoln had been dead 50 years before the first volume of Strunk and White came out, and yet he mastered it. He knew it. No formal education, but those were the 8 words that he followed. Eliminate unnecessary words. You don't get that on a first draft or a third draft or a 7th draft. Relentless editing before you have removed every unnecessary word, such that every word that remains has maximum power. The Gettysburg Address, 272 words. It took him 2.5 minutes to deliver. That's less than half the size of a standard newspaper editorial. I spoke at Gettysburg 2 weeks ago, and they have a wonderful new museum. There was a film, and the narrator said, in less than 3 minutes, he changed the soul of a nation. That was the power of his words. His second inaugural address, the one that ends with malice toward none, with charity for all, 702 words, took him 5.5 minutes. Ronald White, one of his biographies, calls it his Sermon on the Mount. Those are the 2 speeches that are chiseled in stone opposite the Lincoln statue at the Lincoln Memorial. Again, word precision through relentless editing gave every word maximum impact. His second word power trait, like Washington, he never misrepresented or overstated anything. Remember his nickname? Honest Abe. Like Washington, you take every word to the bank. Third, he built rapport with his audiences by using wit and telling stories. He didn't overdo it. He didn't try to be a comedian, but enough to make people smile from time to time, engage with his stories. Fourth, when he reached his persuasion climax in his speeches, he spoke with an impassioned, earnest tone. You saw that in the way Daniel Day-Lewis portrayed him in the Spielberg Lincoln movie, but he never got emotional. He thought being emotional and using your emotions was manipulative, fundamentally dishonest. He didn't want to persuade people that way. It was all about reason and logic and word power. And fifth, and this is the trait that I love the most, he made sure that when he gave speeches, his words always had a rhythm to them so that they could be more easily processed, so that the words, when they entered one ear, could resonate, reverberate, and penetrate. And that way they could be more readily understood and remembered. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ends? This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm. Many of you have read the books of David McCullough. He got rhythm. David told me that every time he finished a chapter in one of his books, that he was ready to send to the publisher. It was in final form, been through dozens of drafts. It was ready to go. But before he sent it, he would have his wife, Rosalie, read it aloud to him in his living room so he could listen and satisfy himself that the words on the page had the desired rhythm. So Lincoln, a great persuader because he maximized word power by speaking language that fit his audience, by tight editing that eliminated unnecessary words and ambiguities, by having credibility from his nonstop, unwavering honesty, and because his words always had rhythm, which allowed them to be better processed and penetrate. Fourth great president, Theodore Roosevelt. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that Roosevelt, during his presidency, that if you get elected president of the United States, then all of a sudden you have the power of the bully pulpit. And in fact, he did. And he liked to preach from his bully pulpit, although he was not a particularly effective speaker. Why? Because he didn't understand the power of rhythm. He spoke at a high speed rate, and he was brilliant. He's probably our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any other president. He read more books than any other president. He, like Lincoln, had a photographic memory. He remembered everything he had ever read from 20 years before. It was incredible. But he spit out his words so fast that they didn't have the power that Lincoln's did. But where he was really great was in the small groups. in particular as a mediator. Now, some of you have been involved in mediations, you know the process, but some of you don't understand it. I'll tell you a brief summary of how it works. You have parties at war with each other. Sometimes it's really a war, sometimes it's a lawsuit. But in any case, people are at war with each other, and they talk, and they try to resolve it, but they can't get anywhere. They keep on fighting. They need somebody who can intervene in the conversation, a neutral, and listen and talk and brainstorm. Where can we find some common ground here upon which we can build a settlement? And that's what Theodore Roosevelt was especially good at. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her biography of him titled The Bully Pulpit, described his power as a mediator this way. He used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas, and his ruthless single-mindedness, together with warmth, unabashed intensity, and pluck of personality, to move people towards settlement. And he was so effective. 1 year into his presidency, there was a national coal strike. All the coal miners had gone on strike, and for months they'd have occasional negotiations with the coal company owners, but they were going nowhere. And winter was coming. And half the country was going to freeze to death because they didn't have coal unless somehow they found a way to end the strike. No American president had ever been involved in a labor dispute before Theodore Roosevelt, but he realized how important this issue was, and so he called the coal miners and the coal company owners into the White House. He listened to both of them. What were their needs? What were their priorities? What could they possibly agree on to bring an end to this strike? And then with the charm of his personality, you've seen his big teeth, his big smiles, his electric energy, he would lean on them until they finally agreed to a settlement. And that's what he did with the coal strike. He got them to agree to binding arbitration that ended the strike, and nobody froze to death. And the word went around the world. This guy's good. This guy can bring an end to any dispute that there is. And so Japan and Russia were involved in a war. They were killing each other, and they had no idea how to end it. So they called President Roosevelt and said, hey, you think you can do for us what you did in the coal strike? In fact, he did. And for it, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. 2 years later, another dispute in Morocco that he resolved as mediator, and then another couple years later at the Hague Convention. So this up-close and personal force of personality, this emotional intelligence to get people to buy into what he was wanting to get them to do to bring a settlement, and those were the skills that made Theodore Roosevelt such a great persuader. Fifth great president, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was persuasive because he mastered not one but two ways of public speaking. First, oratory. Speeches to the masters with snap, crackle, and pop delivery. Maybe you've seen the newsreels of his first inaugural address. March 1933, the country's in the midst of the worst depression we've ever had. People are homeless. People are hungry. People feel hopeless. And nothing that Herbert Hoover had done had made them feel any better. But here's this guy with the big smile, with the gleaming eyes, with the self-confidence, the unmatched. And he says at the start of that first inaugural address, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. It made the country say, this president isn't afraid of the depression. If he's going to go into it with that kind of a positive attitude, I think we can turn this thing around. So from the very first day, that spirit of power to the masses, through the snap, crackle, firm vigor of his words, inspired the nation. Another famous example of his oratory came the day after the bombing at Pearl Harbor. And here were his opening words. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. We will not only defend ourselves to the utmost, we'll make certain that this form of treachery never happens again. It made Americans want to step up, join the war effort, win the war starting right now. The power of oratory. But he also had a second means of speaking to the masses that was different. And that was a calm conversational style that he used in his famous fireside chats. On the 8th day of his presidency, he gave his first fireside chat, and here were the circumstances. Right after his inauguration, people were panicking over the Great Depression, and so they went to all their banks and they pulled their money out and they put them in their mattresses. They thought all the banks were going to fail. There was a national bank panic. And Roosevelt, to respond to it, to stop the panic, shut all the banks. He called it a national bank holiday. And a couple of days later, he gave his first fireside chat where in a very calm voice, he told the American people, this is what we've done. This is why we did it. This is what we're going to do going forward. There's no reason to panic. End of speech. The next day they open the banks, people bring their money back to the banks. In that knowing the right tone to calm down the panic, he ended it. That's an example of knowing when to use which tone, when to use which medium. But for both types of persuasion, whether it was the public oratory or the calm delivery on the radio, he succeeded because he knew what the people wanted to hear, because he had his finger on the pulse of America's public opinion. And I don't mean just one segment here and one segment there. No, he had his finger on the pulse of America's public opinion all over the country. Well, how do you do that? Well, first of all, he held frequent press conferences. He welcomed any and every question to know what was on the mind of Americans across the country, and he held a record number of press conferences. Don't you wish we had that today? He also canvassed the country on train and car trips in a listening mode. What was on people's minds? What were their needs? What were they wanting the government to do? He also had his wife Eleanor stay on the road all the time, traveling the country again in a listening mode, and she'd come back to Washington and report to her husband, here's what people in Arizona and Michigan and Rhode Island are thinking. He also stayed on top of the newly developing industry of public opinion polls, and finally, he listened to what the leaders of both political parties had on their agendas. Frequent meetings to make sure he was in sync with what the leaders of Congress were aspiring. And then once he knew what all the people were thinking, which was often different from what he thought they should be thinking, he moved them his way by delivering his messages in increments, knowing that if you go too fast, people can't process it, they can't reach an agreement to follow it. It takes time. That's the way human beings are wired. If you want to make a big change in your organization and you come out on the first day and say, everything's different, here's a new plan, live with it, accept it, I'll see you later. That's no way to do it. And Roosevelt knew that. He knew you had to give people time to understand what was behind this new plan. In particular, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, as Hitler's reign of terror was going on and he was taking over country by country by country, Roosevelt knew that most Americans at that time were stuck in a mindset of isolationism. We don't want to go to war halfway around the world. We did that 20 years ago. We don't want to do it again. But Roosevelt knew that if we stayed stuck in isolationism, this guy Hitler was for real. And in time, he would take over Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, the high seas, and aim for the United States. So to get the American people unstuck from isolationism, over time in these fireside chats, incrementally, he moved the needle to where they would finally move away from isolationism to internationalism. He said things, again, softly on the front end, knowing they didn't want to think about going to war halfway around the world. So this is not a statement about war. It is a statement about national security. In another chat, again, as Hitler is getting more and more control, he said in the chat, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war, knows that it's stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Now, who could disagree with that? And so his words, messaged strategically, step by step over time, so people could process where he was coming from, what the needs were, in time to wipe away where they were stuck and toward what needed to happen, and it happened. And that's how persuasion works best. So Franklin Roosevelt, a persuader who knew when to speak with vigor